The Hatchetman by Mack Reynolds and Fredric Brown. Chapter 1. Matt Anders arrived at the new Albuquerque spaceport on Venus in the early afternoon. His identification papers showed him to be one Harvey Giles, merchant, Philadelphia, Earth. Purpose of visit to Venus, purchase of precious stones. He was tall, but stooped with age. His gray hair and seamed face matched the photographs on his identification papers. Any resemblance to the real Matt Anders was impossible to detect. He let the mechanics roll away the one-man space Zephyr, while the two guards who had come to meet him escorted him to the administration building, where his identification papers were checked and approved. After that, he was free to leave, carrying his briefcase containing, except for one secret pocket, only papers pertaining to his assumed identity. A land cab swung in to pick him up. He hesitated momentarily and then waved the driver away. The residence of the Terran ambassador was less than half a mile distant, and a chance for exercise would be more than welcome after 35 hours in a tiny spacecraft. He took a deep breath of the exhilarating Venusian air and started down the street. He felt no sense of danger. It was broad daylight, and New Albuquerque is a safe, well-policed city. Only a few people on Earth, and those were men in positions of high trust, knew of his presence here or the form of his disguise. The various unorganized crackpots and malcontents who hated him could not possibly know. And aggression on the part of the Martian duplies here on Venus, Anders didn't even consider. Mars was trying her best to keep Venus from taking sides in the strange Cold War she was waging with Earth, a war in which neither side had made a direct move against the home planet of the other, although millions of men had died in space and in attacks on outposts. Certainly, Mars could not risk antagonizing Venus by any overt act on the neutral planet. So it was the very unexpectedness of the attack against him that enabled it to succeed. For a moment, except for him, the street was empty. Except for him and the land cab that had offered to pick him up back at the spaceport. It must have followed him unobtrusively for some distance, and now it contained 3 men besides the driver. It swung up against the curb beside him and disgorged its occupants. 2 men tried to pinion his arms. The other swung an old-fashioned blackjack. Matt Anders dropped his briefcase and tried to swing with his right at the dupli, holding his other arm. The blow was ineffectual, but it was the movement on his own part that caused the sap in the hands of the third man to accomplish less than had been intended. He was dazed by the blow, his knees buckled, and he fell, but he didn't completely lose consciousness. The duplies who had hold of him lifted him and carried him to the cab. The one who had used the blackjack took a quick look up and down the street, picked up the briefcase, and followed them into the cab. The whole thing had taken only seconds, and now he was between 2 of them in the rear seat, and leaning past the one to his right, the third man bent toward him. Now his hand held a hypodermic needle instead of the blackjack. Anders caught a fuzzy glimpse of it from the corner of his eye as the dupli poised the needle to plunge it into his arm. He didn't know what it meant. Not death, most likely, because if they'd merely wanted to kill him, they could easily have finished him off back there on the street without taking the risk of carrying him into the cab. The land cab swung sharply around a corner, and as it swerved, Anders managed to press against the man on his right. He twisted his body so that the plunger of the small hypo was depressed. It lost a full half of its contents on his coat before he felt the prick of the needle. He jerked involuntarily at that, and the wielder of the hypo laughed. "Coming out of the fog, huh? Well, that shot'll take you right back in again." The driver spoke over his shoulder. "He didn't come to, did he? We don't want him to remember anything beyond the blackjack." He wasn't awake, just jerked when he got the needle. But he was awake, and stayed awake. He was dazed, sick, dull-minded, but still conscious and determined to stay that way. Fighting against giving in to the darkness to which his mind wanted to succumb as the contents of the hypo spread through his bloodstream, he lay inert and motionless, deliberately breathing slowly and regularly, hiding every outward evidence of the fight his mind was putting up against unconsciousness. It grew dark suddenly, and he knew they had driven into a garage. The grip on his arms tightened again, and he was half dragged, half carried from the land cab. He allowed himself to open his eyes a mere slit, enough to make out his surroundings. Sure enough, they were in a garage, and he was being hauled toward steps leading downward at the back of it. "Shake it up," one of his captors said. "We're 10 seconds behind schedule now, and don't worry about mussing the guy. He's supposed to be banged up plenty." They hurried him down the cellar steps into a lighted room, a typical under-residence room that contained the standard heating apparatus and laundry equipment of the 22nd century, and the typical trash and odds and ends that clutter a basement in any century whatever. But at the far end of the cellar, screened from view until they rounded a pile of packing crates, was an object that surprised Anders so much that he almost revealed his consciousness. It was a Kingston duplicator, an illegal jerry-built one, here in New Albuquerque. He knew all too well the character of the duplies, products of the duplicator, their complete egotism, their utter lack of any moral sense whatsoever, their cold viciousness and inhumanity. But he was still amazed that they'd have the utter gall to construct an illegal machine of their own here on Venus. Back of the duplicator itself was a huge condenser of a type he'd never seen before, something the duplies themselves must have developed for the purpose. They could load a condenser of that size with enough juice to operate the duplicator once by feeding it current a little at a time over a period of weeks, so there would be no sudden great drain of power that would give away to the authorities the presence and use of a duplicator. It was a clever idea, Anders had to admit to himself. As far as he knew, nobody had used it before. Why, with the use of an attachment like that, there could be duplicators in any city on Earth, undetected and undetectable. He knew now, all too well, what they were going to do to him. If he'd had the least bit of strength, he'd have tried to break then and there. But the combined effects of the blackjack and the drug had left him only an edge of consciousness. He couldn't have stood on his own feet and walked out, even if they'd let go of him. He'd have to wait for a later opportunity, not that he really expected to get one. The machine, he'd seen at first glance, was adjusted for human duplication transmission. They strapped him into the chair, for all the world like an old-fashioned electric chair, except that it had no electrodes, that was bolted to the field platform. When the switch was thrown, there'd be a duplicate of him on Mars, except that duplicate would be a dupli instead of a human being. It would be exactly like him in every way, except that it would lack that intangible ingredient, soul. That ingredient man had never been too sure he had until the Kingston duplicator had proved it to him and had created chaos in the process. Chapter 2. Trouble Comes Double. Venus had been the first planet colonized. The first explorers to penetrate its eternal cloud envelope had found, to everyone's surprise, a breathable atmosphere. This had been hidden from the spectroscopes of Earth's astronomers by the peculiar constitution of that cloud envelope which hid Venus's surface from the observation of Earth. The colonization of Mars had not been possible until almost a century later. There had been only experimental outposts there, under domes, until the technology of the late 21st century had provided the means of creating an artificial atmosphere. This was done by concentrating what oxygen there was in a narrow band close to the surface instead of letting it diffuse itself through the entire depth of atmosphere. Held close to the ground, it made Mars habitable except for mountainous or plateau areas. By that time, constant travel between Earth and Venus had caused interplanetary travel to develop to the point where it was easy and inexpensive, and the colonization of Mars had been very rapid. It had been a spontaneous emigration of the common people that had caused Mars, for a while, to suffer from a lack of trained scientists and statesmen, a lack of qualified leadership. Men who had achieved success and eminence on Earth did not care to emigrate. That's where the Kingston duplicator had come in. It had seemed to be a perfect answer to Mars's problems. It had enabled men like Duclos, Kingston himself, Barry, Wade, and hundreds of others, the men who had contributed most to the science and political leadership of Earth, to remain at home on Earth and to have duplicates of themselves sent to Mars. The duplies were to contribute to the advancement of Mars what their originals had contributed and were contributing to the advancement of Earth. There was a catch, but nobody knew about it until too late. The Kingston duplicator had been invented early in the 22nd century. One duplicator, adjustable either as transmitter or receiver, could send to another, at either close range or interplanetary distances, a duplicate of any object placed in the field of the transmitting machine. It did not involve, of course, any creation of matter. The receiving machine drew upon a hopper of anything at all, usually sand, which was transmuted electronically into whatever elements were needed for creation of the duplicate. With respect to inanimate objects, the Kingston duplicator had only one theoretical limitation, one that was learned the hard way. Fissionable material, even in less than critical quantities, could not be transmitted duplicated without exploding in the sending machine. The duplicator had, of course, changed the economy of Earth and of Venus and Mars, but not completely, not too greatly. The tremendous amount of power it required prevented its practical use for the reproduction of anything except expensive and valuable things. Of what benefit to reproduce a bushel of wheat or a chair at a cost of $1,000 worth of power when you can grow the wheat or make the chair much more cheaply? On the other hand, a $5,000 mink coat becomes less of a luxury item when it can be duplicated for a fifth of that sum. Small precision instruments, very valuable relative to weight, became cheaper in duplication. Rare metals and elements, except the fissionable ones, became less prohibitively expensive, and thereby opened new fields to technology. The government had made one restriction to protect the investment of those who had money invested in precious stones. Diamonds, except those necessary for industrial use, were restricted. So were human beings. Early experiments with lesser animals had shown that duplication of them was quite possible without apparent harm to the animals, and also without commercial possibilities, since it remained cheaper to raise a pig than to duplicate it. But before a single human being had been duplicated by a Kingston duplicator, governments, acting in concert, ruled against the attempt. If for no other reason, there would be too many legal difficulties involved in the duplication of a human being. A wife could find herself with duplicate identical husbands. A job or a bank account or an insurance policy would find itself with duplicate identical claimants. And which was the original, and what would be the rights of the duplicate? And besides, there was no logical reason for permitting the duplication of a human being. Until the lack of technicians and leaders in the new Martian colonies suggested an advantage to human duplication that seemed, if proper restrictions were observed, the perfect answer to the problem. Suppose Duclaw, top electronics engineer of Earth, and electronics engineers were badly needed on Mars, agreed to have a duplicate of himself created on and for Mars. Duclaw had nothing to lose, except that he signed a paper agreeing never to leave Earth, which he had no desire to do anyway. His duplicate would be required to agree never to leave Mars. The Martian government would give the dupli an amount of money equal to whatever the original possessed. Only men with no close family ties could be chosen. As long as they remained as far apart as Earth and Mars, there could be no conflict of personal interests between them. It seemed foolproof, and the experiment was permitted. Duclaw was duplicated. His dupli took over electronics development on Mars and voiced no objection to his lot. Wade, top man in interplanetary economics, Kingston, inventor of the duplicator, acquired a duplicate on Mars. Several hundred others, top men in every other important field. Then the catch, the unsuspected missing ingredient. The first of the duplis had concealed, cleverly, their essential non-humanness, their plans, until the quota had been filled. Then, all of them, starting with those in positions of power at the top, they had taken over Mars, and few of the human people of Mars knew or even suspected that they had been taken over. There were top statesmen, top propagandists among the duplis. And now Mars was at war with Earth, a peculiar war. Strapped in the chair, Matt Anders suddenly realized that he should have fought his captors even without chance of winning, on the off chance that he might have been killed in the struggle. Until this moment, he hadn't realized how much better it would have been to die rather than to be duplicated on Mars. For his duplicate would, at least after indoctrination, be on their side, and his duplicate would know every political and military secret of Earth known to him. Matt Anders, right-hand man, Hatchetman extraordinary of Dwight Morphy, president of the Council of Nations of Earth. The top secrets, just about all of them, of Terran policy and planning. It wasn't only his ability, valuable as that alone would be to them, that they were duplicating, it was his knowledge. The instant he realized that, he would have rushed to commit suicide had there been any possible way for him to do so before they threw the switch. For a second, blinding light played around him, but he felt nothing, except for the slight temporary pain in his eyes from the light, and that could have been avoided by a blindfold. Duplication was painless, without sensation. Then the sudden after-effect that had been noticed in every living thing, animal or human, who had been duplicated, temporary unconsciousness that would last a few minutes. He felt himself slipping into it, and he knew, and was past caring, that in his case he'd never waken from it. Now that they'd duplicated him, they'd kill him quickly before he came out of the after-effect, before they even unstrapped him from the chair. The last thing he knew was that somebody was telling somebody else to hurry, damn it, hurry, and then the blackness and the blankness came. Someone was shaking his shoulder gently. Someone was saying, "Are you hurt badly? Was it a hit-and-run car? Should I call an ambulance?" Matt Anders sat up groggily. He was at the point along the street where he had been attacked. He looked about him. His hat was lying in the gutter, and his briefcase was where he had dropped it during the brief struggle. The land cab wasn't in sight. There wasn't any evidence at all that he'd been kidnapped and then returned to the same spot where the assault had occurred, and they thought he'd been unconscious since that first blow with the blackjack. He wasn't supposed to know anything besides the assault had happened. He wasn't supposed to know that he'd been duplicated. And he hadn't any proof, except his own word, that he had been. The Venusian authorities would tell him his story was fantastic, and it would sound that way. It was fantastic that there could be an illegal private duplicator operated by duplis here in orderly and peaceful New Albuquerque. He himself could hardly believe what had happened. The Venusian authorities would accuse him of lying in order to create an interplanetary episode. "Are you all right?" somebody said. "Shall I call an ambulance?" He put his hand to the back of his head as he turned to look up. The man standing behind him was small, mild, inoffensive, a typical clerk or bookkeeper from one of the government offices. "I'm all right," Anders said. "I'll be all right in a minute. Just a sore noggin from a sap." "A sap? Oh, you mean a blunt weapon. Were you attacked and robbed?" Had they been that thorough? He put his hand into the pocket where he'd carried his money. It was gone. They'd been thorough enough to make it look like an assault and robbery. Not that the money mattered. Once he was out of his disguise, his signature was good for any reasonable amount at any Venusian bank, but the valuable information in his briefcase? No, they wouldn't have bothered tampering with that. The papers in the secret compartment were valuable only for the information on them, and that information was in his head as well. It would also be in the head of his dupli on Mars. He got to his feet a little shakily and found that he was all right, except for the ache in the back of his head and the dustiness of his clothes. He said, "I'm all right, thanks." "You're sure? You're sure you don't want—" "I'm sure," Anders said. "Thanks a lot, but I'm sure. I've got only a block to go, and I'll report this to the police from there." He knew it would seem strange to the little clerk if he didn't intend to report it. He got his hat and briefcase and started off, a bit waveringly at first, but more firmly after he'd gone a few steps. After one try at putting the hat back on his head, he carried it in his hand. His head would be too sore for days to let him wear a hat. He grinned wryly as it came to him that his duplicate on Mars would have an equivalently sore head. The blow of the blackjack had fallen before the duplication. He was less than 15 minutes late when he arrived at Ambassador Pearson's residence. He stopped outside the door long enough to brush most of the dust from his clothes and then rang the bell. Pearson himself came to open the door. He looked blankly until Anders said, "Matt Anders, Mr. Ambassador, please overlook the disguise, at least until I have a chance to remove it." "Anders, but—" Pearson looked down at Anders' clothes. "What on earth happened? Did you have an accident?" His eyes widened. "Or are you Matt Anders? That disguise—" Anders grinned. "Is a good one, but if you'll suspend disbelief long enough to give me access to a lavatory for a few minutes, I think you'll recognize me. And after that, I'll tell you what happened." "Certainly. And while you're there, can I make you a drink? You look as though you could use one. Something Venusian, or—" "Whiskey," Anders said. "A big slug of it, straight, wouldn't hurt me a bit." Pearson showed him a door. "That room will do, and your drink will be waiting, Matt." In the lavatory, it took only a few minutes to remove the thin rubber mask, backed by sponge rubber in places, to change the shape of his features, and to remove the gray wig that had helped cut down the force of the blackjack blow. There was a clothes brush, and it removed the rest of the street dirt from his coat and trousers. He looked at himself in the glass, and the face that looked back at him was a familiar one. A thin, angular face, vaguely Mephistophelian, very Mephistophelian in the many caricatures of him that had been in the newspapers of 3 planets. Not a popular face, even among people of his own planet. The face of a man reputed to wield too much power, and to wield it ruthlessly, and a man whose face, particularly in caricature, looked the part. But a handsome face, an interesting one. A face all too easy to remember, which was why he wore such careful disguises when he traveled alone. How had the Duplis penetrated that disguise? His best friend, and that was probably President Morphy, couldn't have done so. His drink and a comfortable chair were waiting for him when he rejoined Pearson. He sank into the chair and drank deeply and appreciatively. Then he put down his glass and said, "Mr. Ambassador, I believe I've learned the secret of the disasters we've had recently. I believe I know how the duplies have been getting their information." He frowned, and it's about time, if it isn't too late. It shouldn't be any secret that our morale has been on the skids for months. At this rate, in spite of the fact that we control space and have the duplies pretty solidly blockaded, we'll lose the war due to apathy on Earth. Corruption, bribery, inability, let's face it, among our top military leaders. Our munitions industry breaking down from the top. Our diplomats losing points in negotiations with Venus to come in on our side. The ambassador winced at the last sentence. "That's rather a blow under the belt, isn't it, Matt? I've done my best." "Sure, but you're bucking espionage beyond anything you've ever dreamed of. That's what I found out today. Mars knows already every detail of the information and instructions I've brought you, and I haven't even turned them over to you yet." "Good God, Matt, are you sure? How?" Anders told him, briefly, the experience he'd just had, and wasn't supposed to remember. Pearson's face was a pattern of dismay when he'd finished. He thought, and then asked, "But why didn't they kill you? I don't understand that. Duplicated on Mars or not, you're still a valuable man to Earth." "Two reasons, sir. First, the information they'll get from my duplicate will be more valuable to them if, as they think, we don't know they have it. If I disappeared, or were found dead under whatever circumstances, there'd be at least a suspicion that they had the information I was carrying, a copy of it, even though the original was still in my briefcase. Second, what if they plan later to get my dupli to Earth through the blockade, and they do get ships through it, either way, and then have me killed under circumstances where he can step into my shoes?" He leaned forward earnestly, and if that's happened already to some of our top men, it explains a lot, a hell of a lot. "But if that's true—" There was a knock on the door, a soft tap. Pearson frowned. "Must be my daughter. Well, I won't let her interrupt us long." He raised his voice. "Come in." The door opened, and the girl who came through it was, Matt Anders thought, possibly the most striking girl he'd ever seen. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she walked. He remembered now having heard that Ambassador Pearson had a great-grandparent who had been a full-blooded Sioux. It was obvious in his daughter. Her cheekbones were high, her complexion dark, her hair raven black and worn in braids across the top of her head. Tall, lithe, full-breasted, calm-eyed, she carried herself with the pride and dignity of the Plains Indian. And although she was young, possibly 10 years Anders' junior, she had the poise and assurance of a woman who has been conscious of her beauty for years. Matt Anders was on his feet before Pearson's murmured introduction. He swallowed and immediately felt ridiculous at the reaction. But almost all the women he'd ever met had seemed weak and insipid to him. Marta Pearson was something else again. She was almost an atavism. She was as different from the modern woman of the 22nd century as a tiger from its descendant, a tabby cat. And maybe that accounted, Anders thought, for his reaction. He had often suspected that he himself, emotionally, belonged in a different and earlier century. She smiled distantly in acknowledgment of the introduction, but her smile didn't reach beyond her lips as she held out a cool hand to him, and her words were to her father. "I recognized Matt Anders immediately, Father. After all, one can hardly look at a periodical or tune in a visor without seeing the features of the famous alter ego of President Morphy. His Hatchetman, I believe, is the commoner term." Her father said sharply, "Marta!" Matt Anders felt himself blush, the first time he'd done so, to his own recollection, since adolescence. But he made his voice calm. "It isn't always easy to serve your planet in the way your superiors direct, Miss Pearson. especially when your position isn't an elective one from which you can be removed for unpopularity." He hesitated for a moment, then decided to continue. "Hasn't it occurred to you that, disliked as I am, President Morphy is the most respected and loved person on Earth, but if there wasn't a Matt Anders, a Hatchetman, to do certain things for him, perhaps he could not even be re-elected. Right now, he's just about all that's holding Earth together and keeping the anti-war faction from letting the Duplies have their way on Mars." He wondered, even as he talked, why he was bothering to justify himself. He was used to being hated by millions. Why worry about one more? Except that the one more was suddenly important to him. Marta Pearson still smiled coolly. "A convincing little speech, Mr. Anders. Unfortunately, it seems difficult for me to forget that it was you who ordered the Third Fleet to take the Martian base on Calypso at all costs, and all costs turned out to be the loss of 3/4 of the fleet. Oh, they took Calypso, yes, but where were you at the time, Mr. Anders?" She had touched a raw spot. He paled, angry at her, angrier at himself for allowing her to put him on the defensive like this. "I was on Luna, Miss Pearson, when the Third Fleet left there on its mission. I did not accompany it on strict and specific orders from President Morphy. He, not I, thought I was too valuable to risk, especially since I have no training in space combat and would have been of no special value to the fleet." Her smile was openly sardonic now. "Yet you ordered them, and don't deny it was your order, to take Calypso at all costs. And they were obliged to obey that order, even when it was found the satellite's defenses were far stronger than had been guessed."
"Marta,"
her father said again. "And they took it," she went on, "with losses of 3 ships out of 4. My brother was on one of the ships that didn't make it, my fiancé on another." She turned and walked from the room.
"I'm sorry, Matt," Pearson said. "I don't know what I can say or do."
Anders grinned wryly. "You might get me another drink, Mr. Ambassador. If she waited, I could have told her my own brother happened to be with that fleet and didn't come back."
"That I can tell her, and will, Matt, and I wish top secrecy didn't prevent my telling even my own daughter the reason that order was necessary, and would have been justified, even if it had meant complete loss of several fleets."
Matt Anders took the glass Pearson held out to him. "You know that?"
"Yes, uranium on Calypso, none on Mars, which is why that base was of vital importance to the Duplies, and why it was equally vital to us to keep them away from it if they once get quantities of uranium."
Anders nodded gloomily. "If they do, then the war is no longer in space only. We'll have to destroy their cities to keep them from destroying ours, and it will end up with both being destroyed. As long as there's even a chance of the stalemates continuing, anything would be better than that." He flicked his hand in a characteristic gesture, brushing the subject aside. He downed his second drink before he picked up his briefcase and took papers from the secret compartment, which he handed to the ambassador. "Well, here's what I was to deliver to you, sir, and now it's delivered. Only, and keep this between us, work on the certainty that the Duplies have this information too, at least the general outlines of it. If I'd been able to memorize all the minor details and figures, of course, I wouldn't have carried the papers. But my Dupli will know all I knew about it, and that's enough to make it practically worthless."
Pearson looked puzzled. "But you said between us. You mean you're not going to report what happened to you?"
"Not while I'm on Venus. I'm not going to stay here long anyway, just long enough, in fact, to get a night's sleep tonight. I'll leave in the morning, and what I've learned through my own kidnapping and duplication is so important, I want to report it in person, direct to Morphy. I won't even trust the tight beam. We're not sure the Duplies aren't tapping it."
"I see, Matt. Probably you're right, and I'm awfully sorry about Marta.
It could have been worse. At least she didn't take a shot at me, and that's happened 3 times in 3 months back on Earth. Misguided people, and they weren't all duplies either, seemed to think killing me would solve all the problems of the solar system.
Well, I'll talk to her before dinner. By the way, Matt, one thing I've wondered about, not that it matters, did you give that order to the Third Fleet, or did you just transmit the President's order?
Oh, I gave it all right. It became a sudden emergency when we learned about the uranium angle on Calypso, and I couldn't reach Morphy immediately, so I gave the order. Later, of course, he confirmed it, but the publicity went to my issuance of the order, not his confirmation of it. He shrugged. Well, that's part of my job, to take the blame for nasty things off his shoulders. And that was a particularly nasty one from the outside, because we had to hold back, for security reasons, why Calypso was suddenly so vitally important.
Pearson nodded slowly. I begin to see how tough a job you've got. Wish I could tell that to Marta. Suppose I can tell her that it was of vital importance, even if I don't tell her why, and that you lost your brother there too.
Anders said, Don't please. It's part of my job to have people feel like that about me. But he knew, even as he said it, that he didn't want Marta Pearson to feel that way. The girl attracted him as no woman ever had before. The ambassador cleared his throat.
Just the same, I'm going to talk to her. By the way, we dine early on Venus. If you wish, before dinner, to be shown to your room to bathe and... You didn't bring any luggage, so I presume you won't have to change.
The bath sounds good to me, but haven't you heard of wash-techs? I can wash these right under the shower with me, and they'll dry in the original folds in 3 minutes. Luggage will be a thing of the past when these become common, unless one's taking a long enough trip to want variety in costume.
Good. Then I'll show you too.
Wait, Mr. Ambassador. If we can spare a few minutes, I've just got an idea. Let me think it out a second first.
Anders had stood up. Now he sat down again in his chair, and the ambassador sat down again too. After a few seconds, Anders said,
I think it's a good idea. Listen, I know how we can put a crimp in whatever plans the duplies may have for substituting my dupli for me somewhere. They can't know how badly I was injured by that blackjack. They didn't have time to give me a medical examination. Suppose you put out a general story, give it to the newscast services, that shortly after my arrival here, I died of a brain concussion. The duplies will believe it.
But, good Lord, Matt!
Let me finish. You also send a type beam message to Morphy telling him that the newscast story is a phony, that I'll report to him as soon as possible and explain it, for him to arrange so I can land safely in the same disguise and under the same name I use coming here, without being shot as a dupli of myself. The duplies know that disguise, but if they think I'm dead, they won't be watching for me.
But you yourself said we're not absolutely sure they don't intercept our tight beam. What if they do? Anders' hand flipped the possibility aside.
Nothing certain. If they do intercept it, we've lost nothing. If they don't, we're a jump up on them. He grinned. And we can always announce that the report of my death was exaggerated. Much of that will disappoint many people. You'll do it?
Of course, Matt.
Let's see. Earth time. Morphy won't be getting up for a couple of hours yet. Get the telenews story out right away, if you will, but hold off until after dinner on the tight beam correction. No use waking him up. His health's not been too good lately, and he's been working much too long hours. Besides, he thought to himself, it wouldn't hurt Morphy to think for a few hours, if he got the telenews story first, that he lost himself a messenger boy. It might give him something to think about before the secret correction came.
If you want it that way, Matt.
I do. And now, if I could go to my room... Chapter 3. Death for a Dupli. He stripped and washed his clothes first, so they did dry while he bathed himself. The bath felt wonderful, as did the few minutes he spent under the automatic monsieur. By the time he was ready for it, his clothing was dry, unwrinkled, and looking as though it had just come from the factory. Washtex, this was the first time he'd tried it, was going to be popular indeed. He looked at the comfortable, clean-sheeted bed yearningly and wished he could spend a few hours in it. He knew perfectly well that Pearson would excuse him from dinner if he explained how tired he was after the trip from Earth, but all right, admit it, he told himself. You want to see Marta again, no matter how tired you are, and no matter what her attitude toward you may be this time. Refilling his pockets with the sundry things he'd taken from them before washing the suit, he hesitated as he picked up the electro-gun which he always carried in an inside pocket. It was a neat and deadly little weapon, weighing only 6 ounces, but packing the punch of an elephant gun and completely silent in its operation. He shrugged, checked the mechanism, and put it in his pocket. He left his room and walked down the stairs, the neoplast soles of his shoes making no noise whatsoever. As he neared the door of the library, where he'd had his previous talk with the ambassador and his embarrassing encounter with Marta, he heard both of their voices, raised a little, he thought, above ordinary conversational level. Undoubtedly they were discussing him. Probably Marta was being reprimanded by the things she had said, and was arguing back. Curiosity got the better of him. Snooping or not, he wanted too badly to hear what Marta had to say about him to worry, just at that moment, about gentlemanly instincts. He took a few steps nearer the door. He could hear clearly now what was being said. If there was a break in the conversation, or if either voice approached near the doorway, he could start walking quickly and avoid the appearance of having been standing there. Marta seemed to be apologizing for the scene she had made. Matt Anders stood even more quietly. Walking in now would be even more embarrassing than if he walked in on a quarrel. And then suddenly Marta's voice changed, became cold again.
"But, Father, that isn't what I wanted to tell you. It is this. That information Matt Anders brought you mustn't present it at the conference tomorrow."
"I don't know what you're talking about, Marta. I can see, of course, how you could easily guess the reason for Matt's trip here, but why do you say—"
"The Dupleys have that information, yes, but hasn't it occurred to you that they won't have time, by tomorrow, to prepare a suitable rebuttal, that we can't let you present it?"
"I don't— What are you saying, Marta?"
"It's quite simple, Father. I mean this."
Matt Anders had been slower than usual. He should have got it 4 sentences ago. He moved swiftly now to the doorway, and his electrogun was in his hand when he got there. Too late, just in time to see the purple arc of the electrogun in the hand of the Dupley of Marta Pearson leap from its muzzle to the chest of the ambassador. His own electrogun fired at almost the same instant. He stepped quickly into the room, pulling the door shut behind him. There had been 2 thuds of falling bodies, but he doubted that the sound would have been heard in whatever quarter of the house servants were preparing dinner. Houses on Venus are made of thick concrete, and the sound of a jar does not carry very easily even into the next room. They were both dead, of course. He didn't have to verify that. An electrogun discharge doesn't mark a body, but no matter where it strikes, even a toe or finger, it is fully as deadly as a direct hit from a heavy space cannon. His lips thinned back over his teeth as he stared down at the beautiful body that had been a Dupley of Marta Pearson. Had she been a Dupley that afternoon when he had first met her? Well, it didn't matter now. But one thing did matter, and vitally. Had Pearson, before the start of the conversation with what he thought was his daughter, given out the news of Anders' death from brain concussion? If so, Anders was in a hell of a spot. Pearson was the only person who could send a convincing tight beam message to Earth to contradict that report, and Pearson was dead. He didn't even know where Pearson's tight beam transmitter was. It would be carefully concealed somewhere, and would take hours, probably, to find. And he didn't have hours. The servants who were preparing dinner would be announcing it soon. And here he was, with 2 dead bodies on his hands, and nothing about Marta's body that would prove it was a dupli of her instead of the original. And if his own death had already been announced, he was the one who would be taken for a dupli and shot on sight by the Venusian police. Despite the fact that Venus maintained neutrality in the Earth-Mars war, they knew the character of duplis and hated them as much as Earthmen did. No duplis were tolerated on Venus. The members of the Martian consulate had to prove their origin and birth, had to be dupes of the duplis, not duplis themselves. And damn vacillating Venus for that, for refusing to take active part in a war against inhuman things whom they recognized to be utterly evil. But no time to think about that now. He'd have to act, and quickly. His eyes cast about, and found the telenews set on a stand in the corner. He snapped it on, manipulated the dial, until he found a station just starting on a news program. A report or two on the war, news he already knew, and to which he listened impatiently. Then, "It was announced half an hour ago by Terrestrial Ambassador Pearson that Matt Anders, personal aide to President Morphy of Earth, died this afternoon as a result of—" He snapped it off. He didn't need to hear the rest. And Pearson would not yet have sent the tight beam message of contradiction. He'd promised to wait until after dinner for that, and Pearson was a man of his word, even in tiny things. He went to the door and locked it. That would give him seconds of extra time if a servant came to announce dinner. Quickly, he dragged the 2 bodies out of sight behind a sofa. That would give him seconds more and a chance to talk his way out if he had to unlock the door. He sat down in a chair to think. It was fatal to stay on Venus. It would be fatal to go to Earth. Suddenly, he laughed. There was still Mars. And why not? If he could get through the blockade, and others had done it. "I've got a dupli on Mars," he thought viciously. He intended to replace me, if he could. Now, the duplis think I'm dead. What if I can replace him? It sounded like a chance in 1,000, maybe 1,000,000. Or maybe only 100, since the advantage of surprise would be completely in his favor, with the duplis not even suspecting what he intended, since they would think, along with Earth and Venus, that Matt Anders was a dead duck. Suddenly, he was almost glad that tight beam contradiction hadn't been sent. Suddenly, he was free. "Morphy," he thought, "you've lost yourself a messenger boy." How many minutes did he have? Enough to get back into his disguise as an elderly merchant of precious stones. He'd have to have enough minutes, otherwise he couldn't get his space Zephyr at the spaceport. He moved fast now. Telephone, the spaceport. His voice, suddenly the voice of an old man.
"Harvey Giles speaking, owner of Space Zephyr SC-1470. I learn I must return to Earth quickly. My son is seriously ill. Can you have the craft ready for me in 10 minutes? Thank you very much."
The bodies. A better job of concealment, so hidden that they wouldn't show unless someone deliberately looked under the sofa or over its back. Marta's body, so beautiful. Damn duplis. Was Marta alive somewhere? It was unlikely, almost impossible. Why would they have kept her alive after duplicating her, and after having her dupli take her place? They'd kept him alive, but only because they had to wait until his dupli had a chance to replace him. So forget Marta, she's dead. And luckily, her dupli was dead now too. He left the door of the library open behind him. In his room, he jerked the briefcase open, took out the disguise, the rubber mask and wig. He got them on. Not too good a job, but it would pass casual inspection. 5 minutes gone since he'd left the library. How many more before dinner, and for how many minutes thereafter would the servants look around the house before they called the police or found the bodies and then called the police? Down the stairs, and his luck held. Outside, into the early evening. A land cab was going by, and he hailed it. He'd take his chances on it being what it seemed, but his hand was on the butt of his electrogun as he got into it, and stayed there until it let him off at the spaceport. The usual brief formalities, the casual glance at his identification and at himself. On Earth it would have been stricter, but then Earth was at war, and Venus wasn't. His ship was ready, waiting. Blast off! Straight up, of course, first, and when he moved the gyro-turn handle, he turned the little ship toward Earth. Probably there'd be a routine radar check to see that he took the course he'd said he was taking, interceptors notified to challenge him if he didn't. Besides, 8 or 10 hours travel toward Earth would lose him only an hour or two. Luckily, Mars was in the same general direction across the ecliptic. Luckily, too, he'd had Benefrin tablets to keep him awake for the 50-hour trip to Mars. One can't afford to doze on a one-man craft in space, which turned out to be far more crowded with meteors and planetoids than earthbound men had ever guessed. When he hit Mars, he'd need at least 24 hours sleep under another drug to counteract the Benefrin binge, but he'd worry about that when he got there. 45 hours later, and 1,000,000 miles out from Mars, he came to the blockade patrol. His receiver barked, "Identify yourself immediately, or we open fire." The war between Earth and Mars was a peculiar war. Earth could have destroyed Mars at any time, but didn't. Earth had atomic bombs. The 100 cities of Mars, which housed almost 1 billion people, could have been wiped out within a week. But those billion people were colonists from Earth, friends and relatives of almost every family on Earth. The Duplies, of course, knew this emotional appeal and counted on it. They also pointed, propaganda-wise, to the fact that they had made no attack on the cities of Earth and did not intend to. Of course they did not intend to, without uranium to make bombs. Mars itself had no uranium, no fissionable matter of any kind, and it was fortunate for Earth that the Kingston duplicator exploded on any attempt to duplicate a fissionable substance, else all the Duplies would have needed was one small piece of uranium, which they could have duplicated endlessly until they had enough to blow Earth out of the solar system, and no sense of morality to keep them from doing just that. So the war had been in space, where Earth had the edge and had a blockade around Mars, although Martian blockade runners frequently got through it. And the war, unknown to the citizens, was also a war on Earth, a war of espionage, propaganda, sabotage of morale, conducted by a few well-placed Duplies. And Martian propaganda didn't sound unreasonable, for it claimed it wanted only to be left alone. It would have been all too reasonable, except that the billion people of Mars were the dupes of the Duplies under their absolute control. Propagandizing the true Martian colonists about the real nature of the Duplies would have been the answer, but the Duplies controlled channels of communication. All Martian radios and televisors were tight-tuned to the big broadcasting station of Marsport. They could receive no messages from Earth or from ships in space. The Martians were completely shut off from the rest of the system and had no choice but to believe the propaganda their leaders fed them, and their leaders were Duplies. The Martians thought they were fighting a war of independence against Earth. They didn't even know that their independence had already been granted and that they were already a free planet and no longer a colony. Matt Anders continued his course. The next challenge came only seconds later. "Identify yourself immediately, or we fire!" He couldn't safely ignore that one. He pressed the two-way visiplate button, so the flagship which had done the challenging was in visual as well as auditory communication. Lieutenant Commander Gresham's heavy-jowled face appeared on the screen in the little space Zephyr. Anders knew that, in the flagship, Gresham was seeing Anders' face with the disguise long since removed. Anders said crisply, "You know me, Gresham. Confidential mission, highly important." If he could stall a few more seconds, he'd be through. Right now, they probably couldn't fire at him because he was among them. 30 seconds more, and he'd be out of range past them if his bluff worked. If he could only make Gresham hesitate, if Gresham only hadn't heard the news that... Gresham hesitated. His mouth opened a little, snapped shut, then opened again, and he said, "But you're..." He didn't finish, but Matt Anders knew that Gresham had heard the news Ambassador Pearson had given out to the newscasters. 2 more seconds passed, and then Anders knew that he was safe, for Gresham still stared at him. Then Gresham said, "But Anders, we received no orders on this. I must ask you to report to me on the flagship for clearance." And that had killed another dozen seconds. Gresham was stalling, letting him through. Gresham was a dupli, which accounted for the relative ease with which the blockade runners had been getting through. Now Gresham, having heard of his death on Venus, thought that he was one. Deadpan, Anders helped with stalling. "Afraid, Commander, that's impossible. Direct orders, President Morphy. Suggest you check with him." Gresham would check all right, to keep his own nose clean, but even if he got Morphy at once, enough minutes would have been wasted. He was out of range now, already, and with a sigh of relief, he clicked off the screen. He'd never thought before that he'd be glad to find out any highly placed Earth officer was a dupli. If Gresham hadn't been one, he still might have bluffed his way through, but it would have been much tougher going. He landed the Space Zephyr in a high valley between Martian mountains, about 80 miles from the main city of Marsport. A relatively safe place to land the craft and to leave it. The valley was above the level of breathable atmosphere, so no Martian would come there for any ordinary reason. Anders would have to wear an oxygen mask to get down to breathable air, but the Space Zephyr carried one. His only danger of being spotted was from above, and he'd have to chance that. He needed sleep. Almost 100 hours without it, even with Benefrin to keep him going, had sapped his stamina so much that his physical and mental reactions were sluggish, and he couldn't have walked half a mile, even under Martian gravity, without keeling over. He needed at least 24 hours of sleep under the drug that was the counteractant to the Benefrin. Here, before he left the little spaceship, in a spot no Martian would come to, was the best place to get it. He took the counter drug, made himself as comfortable as he could, and was asleep in less than a minute. He slept longer than he'd intended, almost 30 hours, and when he awoke it was night. Deimos and Phobos, the 2 moons of Mars, were in the sky, but gave little light. He'd have to use a hand flash, and once he was in sight of the road over the top of the mountain, he would be conspicuous. He decided to wait until daylight for his trip over and down the mountain to the nearest road. He waited until dawn before he left the Space Zephyr. The range he had to scale, up one side and down the other, would have been a day's work on Earth. On Mars, at 38% Earth gravity, he weighed less than 60 pounds, so it was easy, if sometimes risky, climbing. He was over and down before the Martian noon. As soon as he was low enough for the air to be breathable, he hid his oxygen mask carefully in a place where he could find it again in case he lived long enough ever to want to make his way back to the spacecraft. Then he walked to the nearest road. He stood along the edge, waiting. Luckily, it was a road used not too frequently. land cars whizzed by at intervals of 5 or 10 minutes, just about right for his purpose. He waited until a gray military one came along, with no other car in sight in either direction. He stood still until it was just past him, then drew his electrogun and fired at it. A purple flash darted from the muzzle of the gun to the speeding car. Possibly at that distance, and diffused by the body of the land car, the shock of the bolt may not have been lethal, but it was enough of a shock to the driver to make him lose control. The car swerved, tires screamed. The car tipped and rolled. Anders ran toward it. When he got there, its occupant was dead, his head a gory mess against the broken driving column. He wore a captain's uniform, or what was left of one. Anders waited by the wrecked vehicle, knowing that the next military car wouldn't pass without investigating this one. Civilians would. Hands off anything remotely resembling military affairs were their strict orders on Mars. Several civilian cars went by in the next 20 minutes, slowing down out of curiosity, but pretending not to slow down, and their occupants looking curiously at the wrecked car and at Matt Anders, waiting there so calmly. But none of them stopped. Then the jackpot he'd been waiting for. A gray car that stopped, brakes squealing, just beyond the wreck, and backed up. And the man in it wore the insignia of a lieutenant general. He might even be a dupli. The captain had probably been only a dupe, and Anders had been sorry about that. But what was one life when billions were at stake? The lieutenant general got out of the gray land car and walked over scowling.
"What's this? And what are you doing here? Who are—"
Matt Anders' shot from the electrogun got him. There was nothing to be gained by conversation. He pulled open the door of the wrecked car and shoved the body of the lieutenant general through it. That would stall investigation a little. Whoever found the wreck next would assume the two had been riding together, with the captain acting as chauffeur. A missing military land car wouldn't be looked for at once. Just the same, he got into the other land car as quickly as he could and got away from there fast. He drove 20 miles before he found a side road. He turned into it, and as soon as he was out of sight of the main road, he stopped and looked through the documents compartment of the car. He found what he wanted most, a road map of the area and a city map of Marsport. He also found enough identification to tell him it was the car of Lieutenant General McWheeler. The name McWheeler was recalled to him as being one of the original batch of duplis sent to Mars. McWheeler's original on Earth, he remembered, had been an expert in rocket technology. One dupli less now. He studied the maps thoroughly, memorizing, so he wouldn't have to stop on a main road or in traffic, the route to Marsport. The simplest route through it, which would take him to the domes, the dupli's headquarters. Here, if anywhere, he'd find his own dupli. Beyond that, he couldn't plan. As he neared dupli headquarters, the insignia on the land car he drove, fortunately for him indicating only the rank of its owner, not his identity, proved its value. Sentries snapped to attention, gates were opened. He parked the land car and left it, tried to act casual as he strolled toward the domes. Earth espionage on Mars by no means matched Martian, dupli, espionage on Earth. He knew about the domes, but not much beyond the fact that they were dupli headquarters, and that they were dozens of yards thick and proof against atomic bombing. Which meant that if Earth was ever forced to bomb Marsport, they'd kill everyone except the duplis, the only ones they'd want to kill. There were half a dozen domes, and he hadn't the slightest idea which one to head for. In which of them would new duplis undergoing orientation and indoctrination be quartered? He wasn't alone. There were other people on the walks too, and around the various domes, and he started watching them, hoping for a clue. He'd have to keep watching until he got one. It could be a fatal error to try to enter the wrong dome, and all of them, he saw, were guarded by sentries at the single door of each. He watched the people around him, studying them as carefully as he could without appearing to do so. Some of them, particularly those in uniform wearing high rank, were undoubtedly duplies. The others were undoubtedly ordinary Martians, but those sufficiently indoctrinated by dupli propaganda to be trusted by them beyond all doubt. Most of these were in civilian clothes. A few had washtag suits like his own, a fact that encouraged him. The number of women, in uniform or otherwise, surprised him, and some of them, he noticed, were dressed very seductively. Were they dupli women, who would be, as were dupli men, completely amoral? There had been fewer than 100 women among the original 321st duplicated for Mars, but perhaps the duplis had been willing to extend their quota when it came to acquiring women for themselves, women as amoral as they. He toyed with the thought, and a moment later was sure of it. He recognized one of the women, one of the scantily dressed ones, as Mona Wayne, the most beautiful telestar of Earth, Mona Wayne's dupli, rather, and certainly she hadn't been duplicated to Mars because of her value in espionage. Valuable in other ways, indubitably, although he himself preferred. He jerked his mind away from thinking about Marta Pearson. He'd thought about her plenty in those 50-odd hours in space en route to Mars, but there'd been time enough to think then. Now he had to concentrate on finding his own dupli. He tried to pull his mind away from the thought of her, and just then he saw her. Or her dupli. Another dupli of her. It must be, because it was inconceivable that the real Marta Pearson would have been brought to Mars. There was no reason for it, everything against it. Besides, she was dressed, one might even say undressed, in the fashion of the dupli women, and the fashion became her. She had the body for it. Had she been duplicated for the same purpose for which Mona Wayne, the telestar, had undoubtedly been duplicated? He almost ground his teeth at the thought, and then remembered that this was a dupli. He'd killed one dupli of her just after it had killed her father. He could kill this one as readily. Then they were abreast, and she caught his eye. She said,
"Hi, Matt,"
so casually that it startled him, until he remembered that there was a dupli Matt Anders here, and she undoubtedly knew him and thought she was speaking to him. And that she took his presence so casually for granted proved that his dupli really was here and that he was close to his target. He managed to wave and speak in reply with equal casualness, and forced himself to go to the next crosswalk without looking around. Only then did he turn and look back, lighting a cigarette to cover his standing there, and he let his eyes follow after her until she entered a dome. He waited a few more minutes, and then walked toward the dome into which she had entered. Chapter 4. To's a Crowd. 2 cold-eyed guards stood, one on either side of the door. As he walked toward it, one, the one with sergeant's insignia, stepped forward and barred his way. He said, "The password, sir," courteously but firmly. Anders scowled and continued to advance up to the point where another step would have meant body contact with the man barring his way. He said irritably, "Bother the password, I've forgotten it. You know me." The guard stepped quickly back, and there was an electrogun suddenly in his hand. One appeared also in the hand of the other guard. The first one said, "Our orders are to challenge 3 times. If the password is not forthcoming, we're to shoot." The other one said, "That's right, Mr. Anders. Sorry, but this is the second challenge. The password, please." Matt Anders knew he couldn't get his own gun out in time. He was just deciding the only possible course was to turn and stride away in simulated anger, hoping that they wouldn't shoot him in the back if he didn't wait for the third challenge. A hand dropped on his shoulder. A voice said, "What's the matter, Matt?" He turned his head, deciding in a split second that he wouldn't be surprised whoever stood there. The voice had been familiar, although he couldn't place it. Sean Charlton, head of the WBI, the World Investigation Bureau, top man in counter-espionage. Despite his decision, for a second Anders' mind reeled. If Charlton, of all terrestrials, was a dupli... And then he realized that Charlton wasn't Charlton. The real Charlton had been duplicated somehow, and this was his dupli. But the substitution still hadn't been made, or the dupli wouldn't be here. Charlton's dupli must still be in the indoctrination period, as was his own. He said, "I've forgotten the damn password, Sean." Charlton laughed. He leaned forward and whispered in Anders' ear. Anders said, "Thanks, Sean." To the guards, he said, "Hiroshima." The nearest guard frowned. "That's irregular. He told you." Anders grinned. "Nuts, Sergeant. You didn't hear him tell me. You're just guessing. Besides, it's okay. I just couldn't remember whether it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And I was afraid if I said the wrong one, you'd shoot, so I was stalling. Now I just remembered which of the two it was." It must have sounded reasonable. The sergeant shrugged. He stepped back and holstered his gun. The other guard holstered his. Charlton's dupli and Anders entered the dome side by side. The dupli said, "Lucky, Matt, lucky again that I came along just then. Lucky enough to be the last of the duplis." The last of the duplis? What on 3 planets did Charlton mean by that? He didn't dare ask, but he'd have to find out. They were walking past a building directory of the dome. Anders glanced at it out of the corner of his eye and tried to find his own name among the A's. He saw it, but they were walking too fast for him to catch the room number that followed it. Anyway, he did have a room here. He'd learned that much, and probably his dupli was in it right now. Possibly with the dupli of Marta Pearson. Had she been coming here, by any chance, to see him? It was possible, but only a possibility. As a relatively new dupli, she probably had quarters here too. Anyway, he didn't want to go to his room right away now. First he wanted to find out, if he could, what Charlton had meant by that last of the duplis business. He said, "Let's go to your room, Sean. I'd like to talk a while."
"Okay, and we'll have a drink."
When they entered the elevator, Anders saw that there were buttons for 8 floors. The top view would be small in area because of the dome shape of the building. Charlton pressed the button for the 4th floor. Charlton made drinks for them when they were in the room.
"Ran into your friend Marta just outside the communication dome," he said. "Having trouble with her. She sure acts different since she got back this morning."
Anders wanted to ask where she got back from, but he couldn't risk questions to which he was probably supposed to know the answers, especially not after Charlton had given him the password he'd forgotten. The dupli might put 2 things together and come up with the right answer. He said casually, "Yeah, she does seem a little different. Don't know why."
"Guess it's a tough trip on the blockade runners. Don't worry, she'll be all right when she's rested up. Well, a break for you. Things got fouled up there."
"I didn't get the details on that," Anders said. "Did you?"
"Not except that a wheel came off somewhere. She had to kill her original along with the old man, so she couldn't substitute. No chance to get rid of the body in time, so they brought her back."
A pulse was throbbing in Matt Anders' temple. He knew the Marta Pearson he'd killed was a dupli, and this Marta, the one he'd seen enter the dome, had just arrived here this morning on a blockade runner, not via duplication. Could it possibly be? Charlton was saying,
"Drink up, I'll make us another,"
and he took Anders' glass.
"Yes, you're a lucky guy, Matt. The last dupli."
How could he fish for information about that without asking? If the duplis were stopping duplication of humans, stopping it completely, it meant something important, damned important. A change in plans, a showdown. "Quite a plan, huh?" he said.
Charlton came back with the glass. "It can't miss. They won't even be able to strike back from Earth. Oh, the blockade fleet is probably carrying a few atomic bombs, but Gresham's in charge of the fleet, and if nobody mentioned it to you, he's one of us. If he can get away with it, he'll surrender without dropping a bomb once Earth is kaput. If he can't, well, the fleet hasn't enough stuff to do more than 10% damage to us, as against 95% to Earth." He laughed. "There isn't a town of less than 5,000 there that hasn't got a duplicator, and dozens of them in every big city. Imagine an A-bomb going off simultaneously in every duplicator on Earth. What a bang that'll be, and enough radioactivity in the air to kill off everything that's left. That's the only bug in the plan. It'll be so many years before we can take over Earth. That radioactivity'll last a long time."
Anders stretched his lips over his teeth in what he hoped was a grin. The Duplies, probably the Dupli of Kingston himself, had figured some change in the transmitter end of the Kingston duplicator that enabled an A-bomb to be sent from a transmitter without exploding. And if it exploded in the receiving end, well, that was what they wanted it to do anyway. And that would be the end of Earth. And what could he do here alone? Was there any way he could get more details without arousing? The hell with that, he thought suddenly. What did it matter if he aroused Charlton's suspicion here alone with him in his room? Why not take the shortcut? It meant he'd have to kill Charlton, but that would be a pleasure, next only to killing his own Dupli. Duplies weren't people. He finished his drink and put the glass down carefully. Then suddenly the electrogun was in his hand, aimed at the Dupli. Anders said quietly, "Don't move." Charlton didn't move, except that his eyes widened. He said, "What?" And then, in a different voice, "I get it, and I gave you the password. And now you're going to give me information. I haven't got time to fish for it. Give me the rest of the details of that plan." "If I tell you, you'll kill me anyway." "Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll knock you out and tie you up. I'll decide that later, but if you don't talk, I'll kill you right now. Want to talk?" Charlton licked his lips. He said, "All right. You won't be able to do anything about it anyway. What do you want to know?" "When?" "Tonight, pal, tonight. It's almost ready to go now. You won't be able to do a thing about it." "How did Kingston, or whoever it was, fix the transmitters to send atomics?" "I'm no technician. I don't know that. But I know they can do it, have done it. Where do you think we got the uranium? About a pound of it is all we got off Calypso before you got our base there, but Kingston and his gang got the bug out of his apparatus. There's an attachment they put on a machine that lets it transmit or receive radioactives. Touchy to operate, but it works. They duplicated that pound of uranium into enough for 3 juicy bombs, and they've got 3 transmitters, each being adjusted to duplicate simultaneously in all of the Kingston duplicators on Earth. They're setting the patterns now. Can I have a drink?" Anders nodded. He wanted time to think what else to ask. He looked for flaws in what the Dupli had just told him, and watched carefully meanwhile as Charlton poured himself a straight drink and downed it quickly. Anders said, "This isn't all of a sudden. Something like that takes time, and it eliminates need for espionage. So why, only a few days ago, did you Duplies take me on Venus? With a deal like that coming up, what's Matt Anders to you?" "3 answers to that. 1, although we've been working on this for months, final tests weren't positive until yesterday. 2, we've been keeping on with all espionage activities for the sweet reason that if we stopped them suddenly, something might be missed. We just carried on with all previous plans. 3, and this is in your particular case only, the chief wanted a Dupli of you to serve him on Mars as you've been serving Morphe on Earth. You were to be, your Dupli was to be his Hatchetman. He isn't going to substitute for you. He's going to stay here and help hold Mars in line." Anders swore. It made sense. All 3 reasons made sense, and explained a lot of things. Where are the 3 duplicators that are going to send the bombs to Earth?
I don't know.
Anders raised the muzzle of the gun slightly.
Charlton said quickly, I don't know, I tell you. Nobody knows, except a few of us assigned to operate them. And you know I wouldn't be one of them, not knowing one end of the duplicator from the other. You know I'm no technician.
He was right on that, but maybe he was still lying.
Charlton said, Listen, use your head. That information would be top secret, just in case of something like this happening. Why should anyone be told where the machines are? I doubt if anyone, from the chief on down, knows where all 3 of them are located. They're in different places, hundreds of miles apart. Just in case there's a spy among us, as there damn well is, I just found out, so he can't possibly get a message to the blockade fleet and have those machines bombed before they're ready to go.
It made sense. Duply sense. With 3 machines, widely separated, any one of them sufficient with 1 A-bomb apiece to be duplicated endlessly. And that was why Charlton had talked so readily, knowing he couldn't possibly give the final and most vital piece of information under any pressure. Anders stood. Should he take time to knock out and tie up the dupli, or simply... Charlton stood, too. He was a little drunk. He must have been drinking heavily before Matt had met him, or he would not have been so affected by the few drinks he'd had now, even though the last had been a long, straight one. He said,
All right, Matt. It was a good gag. Pays me off for the one I pulled on you yesterday, and I went along with it for you. Now, let's shake hands on it, huh?
He took a step forward, his hand out, and then the step turned into a sudden dive to get in under the gun. Too late. The gun flashed, caught him on the top of his head at 1-foot range. He'd saved Matt Anders, deciding what to do with him, and in a way that met Anders' fullest approval. Anders went out quickly and back to the elevator. At the first floor, this time alone, he stopped to look at the directory. He picked his own name again, and this time the room number 2, 518. Marta Pearson, 310. He punched the elevator bell for the 3rd floor of the dome. He knocked on the door of 310. He stepped in quickly as Marta opened the door, forcing her to take a backward step to avoid being run into. He had to find out right away, and there was a shortcut, crude though it would be. As he closed the door behind him, he grinned at her and asked a question that was deliberately so worded that only a harlot or a dupli woman could fail to resent it. Color rose into Marta's face, and her hand lashed out at him. He caught the hand. He said, Sorry, I had to do that. I apologize. But you're no dupli. A dupli woman wouldn't have blushed, even at that. She jerked her wrist from his grasp and backed away. He said, Marta, I'm no dupli either. We've got to work together, and fast. Something's going to happen to Earth tonight. If we pull what we know about this place, there's just a chance we can stop it. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide.
All right, you trapped me. I'm not a dupli, but you are, and...
He hadn't been watching her hands, and he hadn't guessed that a garment as brief as the one she was wearing could have a pocket that could hold an electrogun, even one as tiny as the one she pointed at him. Only half the size of his own 6-ounce one, it was fully as deadly, although one that size held only a dozen charges. He was careful not to move forward now. He said, Marta, you've got to believe me. Too much depends on it. If I were a dupli, why would I have said I wasn't? Her voice was cold now.
I don't know. How can you prove you aren't? I still don't believe you.
He thought rapidly. Call room 518. You'll find my dupli there, I hope. Get him down here. He had business with his dupli anyway.
Wait, turn around.
She walked up behind him when he turned. She held the muzzle of the gun against his back while she reached around and found the electrogun in his pocket. Then she stepped back again.
All right, I'll give you that chance. Walk over into that corner where I can watch you while I call.
He walked to the corner before he turned. She was standing by the speaker receiver in the wall near the door. She'd already pressed the button, and he heard her give the room number. He heard his own voice say, "Ender speaking," over the communicator.
"Marta Pearson, could you come down to my room a moment?"
"Marta, didn't know you were back. Sure, I'll be down, but it'll be a few minutes, making a report on Venus. I got to finish for the chief. Rush job. Be seeing you as soon as I can get there." She pushed the button again, but the gun hadn't wavered.
She said, "All right, maybe Matt Anders had 2 duplies. Or if there's only one, how do I know which?"
"You don't," he said, "but listen, time is valuable, and we've got a lot of notes to compare. I won't move, and you've got a gun on me, but while we're waiting, save some time by telling me what happened to you on Venus. Was it you who gave me a bad time about that Calypso battle, or was that your dupli, whom I killed later, just after she'd killed your father?"
"That was I. Wait, why should I tell you anything until I know you're not—"
"Because there's nothing to lose. You can always shoot me after you've told me, and it'll save time. Besides, even if you think I'm a dupli, you've already told me you're not one, so what would more details matter?" She thought that over a few seconds.
"All right, it was I who told you off. Then I went outdoors for a walk. I stayed away until it was time for dinner because I didn't want an argument with Dad over what I'd said to you. I was a little late coming back, and I came in the back way because it was the nearest from my direction. I went into the library and was surprised to see no one there. I started to light a cigarette and dropped my lighter. It was a round one and rolled under the sofa, and—"
"You found the bodies?"
"Yes, of course I knew mine was dupli. I guess I panicked. I was afraid and wanted out of there. Didn't even want to stay long enough to use the communicator. There's a security station 2 blocks away, and I guess I decided to run there for help. Anyway, I ran out the front door, and a land cab that had been parked across the street U-turned and pulled up the second I was out of the door, and someone said, 'Get in!' There were 2 duplis in the car, a man and a woman. I knew they'd shoot me down if I ran, even if I tried to get back in the house. So I got in the back seat. Suddenly, my scare was over, and I was calm. I think I know, incidentally, when they duplicated me. I had an accident 3 weeks ago. I was bowled over by a hit-and-run land cab, I thought, and knocked unconscious. They must have taken me to a duplicator then, while I was out."
Anders said, "Then they must have sent your dupli in, just as an assassin, with no intent to substitute her for you. I don't get that. Any assassin would have done."
"No, from things that were said later, they did intend to substitute. The car had been waiting in front to intercept me on my way back to the house. If I'd come back the front way instead of the back, they'd have kidnapped me and killed me, and my dupli would have stayed, and never have been suspected of killing Dad, of course. But you say you killed my dupli, and I'd come back the wrong way, so things had gone wrong for them. They drove to where they'd left their ship, a blockade runner, and, well, we got here this morning. I'd managed to learn enough from them on the way here to get by until now."
"But why? I mean, didn't you try to escape from them before you took off from Venus?"
"I don't know. I might have been able to."
Her eyes blazed.
"I didn't try. I thought that here I might—"
"You might kill a few duplis before they killed you. My idea, too, more or less. But there's something bigger at stake, Marta, something that—" He suddenly stopped and put his fingers to his lips. He'd heard the faint sound of footsteps outside in the corridor. Then there was a knock on the door. Anders stepped back farther into the corner and stood very quietly. Marta Pearson slipped the gun back into the pocket from which she'd taken it, but kept her hand on it. She stood as she opened the door, so she could still keep at least a corner of her eye on Matt Anders. Matt Anders' dupli stepped in. Chapter 5. Decontaminated Vacation. he said, "Marta, darling," as he closed the door behind him. "Wonderful to have you back," and then stepped forward to embrace her. But Marta stepped back away from him even more quickly, and the gun came out of her pocket and up.
"Look behind you," she said, "and don't move outside of that."
The Dupley turned his head and saw Matt Anders. His eyes widened, and despite the threat of the gun in Marta's hand, his own hand went to the inside pocket of his coat and brought out the electro-gun whose mate Marta had just taken from Anders. He said, "Marta, this is no Dupley. This is my original. I'm going to—" He was going to, but he didn't. The gun in Marta Pearson's hand flashed first. It had been a close thing. There was sweat on Anders' forehead as he stepped from where he'd been waiting in the corner. He said, "Sit down. We've got to talk fast and then work fast. Or try to. Listen, here's what I've learned from Sean Charlton's Dupley since I got here." He told it quickly. "Can you confirm that or add anything to it?" Her voice was almost a whisper.
I guess it's right. I didn't know that much, but the few things I did hear fit into that story. That they now had 3 atomic bombs, and that something big is scheduled for tonight. That they had duplicators fixed so they could duplicate uranium, but I didn't know they could send the bombs to Earth and have them explode in. Oh, Matt, that's terrible!"
He nodded grimly. "Anything else? Any details you can add?"
"Well, this, but I don't see how it helps. When human beings are sent through the duplicators that are gadgeted to send uranium, they don't come out duplies. The duplicates are human beings too, not amoral monsters."
"But how? Why would that—"
"They make this guess. In the human brain, in a certain part of it, there are submicroscopic particles of visionable matter, just as there are minute quantities of so many other substances in the body, too small to detect, and in duplicating a human being in an ordinary Kingston, those submicroscopic particles are exploded and injure a certain portion of the brain, the portion that houses, well, empathy, mercy, humanity, whatever you want to call the quality that makes people human instead of soulless monsters."
Anders nodded slowly. It seemed to explain something that had puzzled him, and everyone else, for that matter, for a long time. And it meant that if ever again a situation arose in which it would be legitimate and advantageous to duplicate human beings, it could be done without creating monsters. But for now, the knowledge didn't seem to help. "Marta," he said, "do you know anything about the setup here? Which domes are which among the others besides this one, where headquarters is?" She shook her head slowly.
"Except the communications dome, that's the small one, and I know they allow only duplies in it and use only duplies as the guards for it."
He leaned forward eagerly. "It's the source of the broadcasts that go out for Martians, the propaganda center from which they send all their programs for home consumption."
"Yes, one of the 2 duplies who brought me from Venus had worked there. He'd been a newscast announcer, and yes, that's where he broadcasts from. And I think it controls communications with Earth, too."
"Come on, then. Let's go." He picked up his own electro-gun where Marta had tossed it onto the bed, and then picked up the duplicate of it which his Dupley had dropped.
"You mean—"
"Yes, let's take over communications. Maybe we can get a message through to Earth. At least we can talk to the Martians, the real Martians, and tell them what the real score is."
"Oh, Matt, do you think we can?"
Suddenly she was trembling, and he put his arms around her to steady her. Then their lips were together, and her arms were around him. Suddenly she pushed him away. There were tears in her eyes, but she was laughing.
"All right, Hatchetman," she said. "Let's go. Business first, if we live through it."
"We'll live through it," he said, and wondered what the chances were. "Straighten your face. We're just taking a casual walk till we get to the door of the communications dome." They had the elevator to themselves. He asked, "How many duplies will be in the building there? Any idea?"
"I've not been in it. At a guess from what I heard, not over a dozen or so. It looks bigger from the outside than it really is. The walls of that one are nearly 100 feet thick. It's the most bomb-proof of the lot, outside of headquarters."
They went along the walk to the smallest of the domes. The 2 guards at its door were in uniforms with high-ranking insignia, one a colonel, the other a major, both duplies. No one else was near, and Matt Anders waited only until he was 10 feet away before there had been a challenge for the password. The hands of both rested on their weapons, but they hadn't drawn them, and it never did. Anders' hand had entered his inner pocket with the deceptive casualness of one reaching for a cigarette. Then the electrogun fired twice. The guards went down. Then Marta and Anders were running through the door along the long tunnel that led through the thick walls. The door at the inner end of the tunnel was a huge thing, beryllium steel, and probably filled with lead to block radiation, 8 feet thick. But it swung on its hinges lightly. "Keep your back to me. Watch," he told Marta as he swung it shut, dogged it down. He played his electrogun over the inner surface of it. The tremendous voltage should short any mechanisms in the door that would permit it to be opened from the outside, probably from the inside too, in which case they were sealed in. He turned back then. Marta's gun was flashing in her hand, and he saw the figure of a dupli who had stepped out of a doorway ahead suddenly fall. "I don't think there's any alarm yet," he whispered to her. "Kick off your shoes. I've got crepe rubber on mine. And here," he handed her the other electrogun, larger than her own, "we've got some hunting to do." The hunting took 15 minutes. The interior of the dome, relative to its outside size, was tiny, less than a dozen rooms. They found and killed 7 duplies, and the place was theirs. The main control room. Anders pointed to the huge bank of condensers, similar to the one, relatively tiny, which he had seen operate the Kingston duplicator on Venus. "Power," he said. "We're self-contained. They can't shut us off the air." He found the microphone. A dupli newscaster who had been using it lay dead in front of it. It had been in operation, and the newscaster's use of it had ended in the middle of a sentence. "Citizens of Mars," he said, "citizens of Mars who are not duplies, this is Matt Anders speaking to you, speaking for President Morphy of Earth. Listen, this is of vital importance." He told them the story simply, everything their own newscasts and sources of information had denied them since the start of the war, and before. He told them the plans of the duplies to destroy all of Earth in one blow that very night. "No, I don't know where the 3 Kingstons are being readied for sending atomic bombs. Some of you probably do. That is, you know a new and ultra-powerful duplicator has been set up and is being heavily guarded. Some of you know where another is. Others will know the third. Smash them, for the sake of Earth, your mother planet. Kill the duplies and take over. I've told you what they really are, how they've fooled you." And he told them again and again, not trying to be eloquent about it, just dishing out facts, straight facts, that the Martian colonists had never been able to hear. Hammering those facts over and over, adding details, circumstantial details, that would make them believable. He was surrounded by panels of switches, but he didn't risk touching one. He knew that the mic into which he was talking was live and directed to all Martian private receivers. He didn't risk trying for more. Maybe he could have reached Earth with a message. Maybe he could have reached the fleet and convinced them that their commander was a dupli, but he didn't know one switch from another and didn't take a chance. He talked, hammered facts. Maybe Earth or the blockade fleet would be monitoring the broadcast and get it anyway. If not, he wasn't going to take a chance on changing any settings. He talked to the people of Mars, talked until he was hoarse, and then let Marta take over for a while, then talked himself hoarse again, repeating, hammering, arguing, pleading. He'd lost all track of time when it happened, the thing he'd been hoping for, the thing that proved he was succeeding. There was a sound that was beyond a sound, and the dome shook. He was knocked from his feet, and so was Marta. He helped her up, his face shining with exultation, and was back at the mic. "Thanks, citizens of Mars. I know now you're believing me that you're doing something about it. The Duplies just dropped one of their 3 atomic bombs on the dome here. They'll drop the other 2. They're losing Mars now that you know the truth, and they've got to try to stop us. It's more important to them to hold Mars right now than to destroy Earth. While you're destroying them, you know who most of them are. If you miss a few, they can be hunted down later. There are only a few hundred of them, billions of you. You can—" Again the dome shook, the second bomb, and they'd dropped the third too. They had to try. They had to see if 3 bombs in a row, in the same spot, would crack the defenses they themselves had made against atomic bombing. They couldn't let him keep talking to the people of Mars. The Duplies were realists. They'd know it would do them no good to destroy Earth in revenge if they were losing control over their own planet meanwhile. They had to stop him. The third bomb, before he and Marta were on their feet from the impact of the second, chunks of concrete fell near them this time, but the dome held, and they'd won. The Duplies wouldn't have wasted one of the bombs on them unless his broadcast was going through. They wouldn't have spent all 3 of them unless their situation was desperate. The Martians were revolting against their Dupli masters. But he didn't quit. There were obviously Martians who accepted the facts he'd been telling them, but maybe there were others who hadn't. The ones who had, since they'd acted so quickly, must already have suspected at least part of the truth, despite the curtain of propaganda that had separated them from the outside. But the others— He went back to the mic. He kept at it. For more hours. Finally, he said, "Marta, if that doesn't do it, it can't be done. Let's try to get something on what's going on. Anything around here that looks like a receiver to you. There must be other broadcasters in other cities if the colonists control them." He turned back to the mic and told what he was going to do. "I'll try to find a way to take an incoming message now." He found it. "Anders, calling Matt Anders. If you hear me, pull over the mic and we can make it a 2-way. I've still got you tuned in on a receiver." "Anders speaking," he said into the mic. Marta was handling the receiver he'd found and tuned it loudly enough so he could hear. "I hear you. Come in. What's happening out there?" "Revolt against the Duplies successful. Got all of them, except some still holed up in the domes. Casualties light, except in the dome area of Marsport. We were besieging the other domes when they dropped those bombs. But we've got cordons around the contaminated area. No Duplies will get out of there alive. Report from your blockade fleet. Your broadcast was monitored there, heard by the Dupli of your commander, as well as by others. He tried to order the fleet to add their bombs to the communications dome you're in, but was stopped. He's under arrest on his flagship. The fact that he gave the order to bomb the dome your broadcast was coming from convinced his under-officers that he was, as you claimed, a Dupli. The fleet has landed, in peace, outside Marsport, and is now helping with the mopping-up operations. There is, peace between Mars and Earth. Many of us had already suspected at least some of the things you told us about our own government. We rose quickly when we knew the truth. Are you hearing me okay?" "I'm hearing you," Anders said. "I think we sealed ourselves in here. How soon can you get us out?" "Don't even try to leave. There's food, water, and liquor in the dome. The whole dome area, and especially after 3 direct hits, your dome, is contaminated with radiation. we'll work at decontamination, but I'm sorry about this. I'm afraid it'll be a week before it'll be safe to try to open the door of your dome from either side." Matt Anders grinned and turned to look at Marta Pearson. He said, "Don't let it worry you. Don't even hurry. I think I've got a week's vacation coming, and I think I can find ways of spending the time."